Hello everyone, I'm Santier, and welcome to another video in my talking about something that's been on my mind and sharing my internal monologue series. And today I want to talk about sacrifice. Specifically, there's something I've been thinking about lately, which is I feel with sacrifices that we can focus a bit too much on the sacrifice and not on the why. So to kind of back up and explain sort of where my thinking is, I feel like a lot of times people talk about sacrifices in terms of what they sacrificed, how much they had to sacrifice, how many sacrifices they made, how much they were willing to sacrifice, all of that sort of stuff, and not on why they were willing to sacrifice or why they made those sacrifices. What was the purpose behind those sacrifices? What ends up happening if the focus, I think, is too much on sacrifices is that it kind of starts beginning to be about the accolades for how much we're willing to sacrifice and not really like what the purpose of the sacrifice was. This is something that I've been thinking about, particularly in religious contexts, because, like, as a Christian, you hear a lot about sacrifice and sacrifices and that sort of thing. But I think it's very easy to get caught up on the sacrifice part. So I think a good example of this is actually the early church with Acts. So there's some stuff in the beginning of Acts, I don't know, around chapter 2 or something, I don't remember precisely. Been a little bit since I've read it, but the basic gist is that the church was doing all sorts of things together, and they were also selling off a lot of possessions in order to provide for each other. So when we talk about this, we tend to focus on how much they were sacrificing for each other, how much they were like selling off possessions and doing all of this. And we kind of fail to take into account why they were doing that. We're just like, oh, righteous, godly people, holy people sacrifice stuff. It's like, but that's not actually, like, the angle is, why are they sacrificing, right? They're not sacrificing for the sake of sacrificing. That doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to deprive yourself for the sake of sacrifice in this sort of way. Maybe you are sacrificing something to try to avoid temptation. That could be a valid reason for sacrifice. What they were doing in that particular Acts example is they cared so much about each other that they wanted to make sure that they could provide for their fellow Christians, so that way none of them went hungry or without at least something to wear, without a place to live. And so they were willing to sell possessions in order to see that their fellow believers were provided for and cared for. That was the point of their sacrifice. Their sacrifice was out of love for their fellow Christian and wanting to take care of them. It wasn't just because they had all these possessions and, oh no, now that we are believers, we need to not have possessions because somehow we've fallen into this idea of asceticism, which is not what that was about at all. It's not about the sacrifice. It's about how much they were willing, like how much they loved each other, how much they cared about each other, that they were willing to part with their own possessions in order to take care of each other. And it's that focus on taking care of each other that I think needs to get emphasized. Another example of this sort of thing is from Jesus talking about, in one of his parables, about the kingdom of heaven being like a pearl of great worth that somebody finds, and they go and sell all they have to buy this pearl of great worth. And we tend to focus on, oh, this person sold all they had. And we lose track of, well, why did they do that, though? They did it because they wanted what they would gain from that sacrifice, the pearl of great worth. And so these ideas of, well, why the sacrifice, I think is really important, because we're not called to just sacrifice for no reason. Even the Old Testament sacrifices were for showing praise and worship to God. Things like sin offering were for the purpose of cleansing somebody from sin, for example, which is, what Jesus did. Like, Jesus' sacrifice on the cross wasn't something that he did because he wanted to make a big sacrifice. It was because he wanted what he got from the sacrifice. Like, Hebrews talks about this, right? For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. Like, it was for the joy set before him of winning a family to himself that Christ sacrificed like that. And so it's very easy, I think, for us to focus on the sacrifice angle and neglect the why angle, neglect what is being obtained through that sacrifice. And I think it's really important that we don't do that, because then we undervalue what we're obtaining through that sacrifice. And I also think it's helpful to frame things properly as well. Like, for example, if somebody's demanding we sacrifice, why, like, what is it that we're obtaining through that demand, through that sacrifice? Is it something that's worth sacrificing for? And this is where we need to have our own values, need to understand, like, loving each other is often a worthy sacrifice. Like, it's often worthy to sacrifice to obtain that. Uh, but we have to be very careful, I think, to not place so much emphasis on the sacrifice that that's all we're talking about or all we're looking at, because then we get the wrong idea and we think we need to sacrifice just to sacrifice because that's the thing that we do. And that's not it at all. That's not it at all. So thank you all very much for listening. And you can support me at patreon.com/Santier. That's all I had to say on this. So until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.